Good morning, everyone. My name is Leonor Cordovil. I'm a professor of antitrust and regulation, and I would like to extend my welcome to everyone here today and express my deep gratitude to those who made this event possible. First and foremost, the Professor Yoo, whom we greatly admire for taking the time out of his business schedule in Brazil to be with us today, and to Leticia Serek and Luis Fernandes, both UPenn alumni students, for bringing the professor to us. I also would like to thank Alexandre Ferreira and Roberta Rios for sharing your practical knowledge on the subject, and because we know you are directly involved in the debate. My thanks also to my colleagues Guilherme Ribas and from IBREC, and for all support, and Professor Caio Mário, my partner in many adventures. Finally, but certainly not least, to Andrea Lasevicius and Yasmin Salgado, and to everyone on our Research Center for Competition, Public Policy, Innovation, and Technology, Comppit, for all the work and organization. Before we begin, I need to read a disclaimer of our law school. The manifestations expressed by members of the staff of Getúlio Vargas Foundation and by guests who participate in the event represent exclusively the opinions of their authors and not necessarily the institutional position of FGV. We also reiterate that everyone present here agreed to participate in this event spontaneously, and with that authorized the use of their name, voice, and image, in addition to assigning the patrimonial copyrights related to their exposure for this transmission, and later remained to the official channels from FGV. To continue with this transmission, we ask that you express your agreement by verbalizing or signaling your agreement. Yes? Okay, thank you. I wish everyone a very successful event. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you, Leticia.
Hello, you can hear me? Yeah. Okay, so it's a great pleasure to be here. My name is Leticia. I just completed my LLM at University of Pennsylvania, where I had the opportunity to be like to have the connection, to make the connection, and to take classes conducted by Professor Yoo. So Professor Yoo holds the title of Professor of Law, Technology, Professor of Communication, and also Computer and Information Science. He's also the founding director of the Center of Technology, Innovation, and Competition at University of Pennsylvania. So it's a pleasure to have Professor Yoo here to share with us your unique perspective on the regulation of digital markets, outlining the American experience together with our distinguished Brazilian panelists. So I would like to thank you all the panelists for being here. Also, I would like to thank you, the Penn alumni that are here with us today. So Professor Yoo is going to open the panel, explaining, like giving the keynote, which will be followed by each of the panelists with a speech. So Professor Yoo, now you can, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Leticia, and thank you very much, Leonor, for hosting me. It is a pleasure to be here for the first time at FGV. I'm amazed at the wonderful facility you have here, although you tell me it's almost as new for me as it is for me. And thank you to the University of Pennsylvania alumni who are here, because it is gracious to be hosting here. Brazil is becoming an increasingly important place where students come from to study at the University of Pennsylvania. And I think it's really appropriate to be here at FGV because in many ways the legacy of Penn is very similar to that of FGV. So one of the jokes we often say is many times in US law schools, people and faculty and students are obsessed with constitutional law and public law, and the stars on the faculty are always the public law professors. Because we have the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania and an interdisciplinary commitment across the entire university, things are very different at the University at Penn, which is we see a large number of our students come to there to do JD MBAs, to get certificates at Wharton. A huge proportion go to work on Wall Street, and it's a much more business-focused place. And I can't think of a better analog to that than in Brazil than FGV, because it's that same sort of sensibility, understanding that, yes, there are many important public law issues, but that innovation, growth, productivity, and GDP, business activity are the lifeblood of any country in terms of moving forward, and it's a problem for all of us. Actually, I'm feeling bad, all the speakers. I have slides. You should feel free to move to where you can see them if you would like, because if I were you, I'd feel very uncomfortable doing this for the. Oh, you have them there if you like, but however you feel comfortable, please feel free. Okay. All right. So the reason I'm going to focus, the invited topic of my talk is regulation of the digital markets, transplant of concepts in the American experience. What it's really motivated by, transplant of concepts to me really taps into a debate which I think many of you are aware of. The EU has passed a new legislation called the Digital Markets Act, which takes a very different approach to regulating large online platforms, to the big tech companies. And in fact, what we're seeing now is a dialogue across the entire world in India, in Australia, in Japan, in Korea, in Germany, in the UK, and many other places about whether to follow the EU's lead. And so this is a fun, and obviously for those of you who follow this, it's a big conversation here in Brazil. And so one of the things I'd like to do is to share with you some of the early experiences under the DMA as they occur in Europe, but also to talk about how, from a US law perspective, what questions they have to answer for whether it makes sense. And I will tell you, as an academic, my mindset is always we're not effective to say, here's the answer, why? Because I am an authority and I say so. If you're doing an academic exercise, everything should be falsifiable. We're about just generating testable ideas. And we should be trying to think, I learned this in one of my early conferences. I was asked by a person from the audience, I understand what you're saying, but what data could I show you that would change your mind? And the answer, I realized, if the answer is nothing, what you're doing is not academics. It's politics or ideology or perhaps even religion. And so I always try to think about frameworks, heuristic ideas, especially in a policy world. No policy solution is the right answer all the time. So the question has to be, when is a given policy answer the right answer and when is it wrong? We have to have frameworks. We have to have testable ideas. And my hope is to offer you the US experience in competition law to give you the frameworks that we've identified, which are largely informed by the economic literature and economic research. All right. So briefly, I'll talk about the early impact of the DMA. There is a broader discussion about whether the DMA represents a shift from competition law, which is ex post, case-by-case enforcement, to ex ante rule-based enforcement. There's a general question, when is that the right move? And then the more specific question is, what can we say about the specific kind of ex ante regulation built into the DMA? And so I'll talk about ex ante regulation, the abstract, and then the specific. And then I'd like to talk about some of the implementation challenges. One of the things that's going on is the DMA is largely modeled on telecommunications regulation. And as a person who began the study in telecommunications, what bothers me is they are making that move and they make claims and saying such things, certain remedies will be very easy. And my reaction is you cannot make that statement unless you've studied the history of telecommunications regulation and the scholarship understanding it. The debate has largely ignored it, and that's why, among other things, one of the reasons I'm here is I'm working on a book, an edited volume coming out in Cambridge University Press to apply the lessons of telecommunications regulation to the DMA to see what we can learn. And then lastly, I'll talk about some of the alternatives because when I gave this talk in Thailand, they assumed that the DMA was the only answer. And one of the things that we had to complexify is that the UK, Germany, Japan, Korea are following different approaches. And that it's only one of many candidate answers, and I'd like to lay that out for you here. So very briefly, if you don't know what the DMA is, normal competition law, you let people do the plans, they adopt practices or merge companies as they see fit, and then you assess the impact on consumers after the fact, taking all circumstances into account. The DMA is a very different approach. What it does is it sets up an ex-ante regime where liability is not determined by effects on consumers. It's determined by the size of the companies, of the digital platforms. And the size is measured in terms of revenue or the number of users. There's sometimes they look at market capitalization. And they actually look at that. And if you exceed as a company a certain size, you can be designated as a gatekeeper. And if you become designated as a gatekeeper, you have a chance to rebut that presumption in some ways that we don't really understand because it's so new. And then if you are successfully designated as a gatekeeper, you are subject to 10 mandatory remedies and 12 optional remedies. And the remedies include things such as mandatory interoperability, mandatory data portability, bans against self-preferencing and the like. As of this point, the EU has designated 6 companies, and that is Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, ByteDance, Meta, and Microsoft, and has opened up non-compliance investigations against 3 of them, that is Alphabet, Apple, and Meta. And so we have some active things going on here that are moving, and it's an interesting framework. We'll talk a little bit more about why this is such a break and what's the difference between this and competition law. But before that, I actually love facts. And so let me give you a few facts. The DMA has only been in force a few months. What do we know? So what do we know? Right now, one of the big surprising unintended consequences is it has had fairly negative impacts on certain small and medium-sized enterprises, particularly the travel industry. Hotels, even larger enterprises like airlines, shops and different kinds are all complaining that they're losing business. What's happening? Hotels vastly prefer that you book your reservations through their hotel website. If you go through an intermediary, they have to pay a significant commission to whoever you're booking through. Unfortunately, the studies are showing that with the changes that Google has had to make to their search engine, visits to hotel websites are down 30%. Direct bookings are down 36%. Where are these bookings going instead? They're going to other intermediaries like Booking.com and Expedia, which is lowering the revenue earned by hotels because reservations they used to get directly to the websites are now going through other intermediaries where they have to pay for the visits. And this has been sort of a bit of a surprise. One of the things that's interesting is, and as a result, trade associations are complaining, politicians are complaining, CEOs are complaining, and it's not entirely clear what, people were surprised by this. Now, what's going on? The benefits, the DMA is targeted online intermediaries, but only of a certain size. Apparently, the new rules are not favoring the small companies who they thought they were going to help. It's favoring other intermediaries who are not big enough to trigger the threshold. And what's going on? Google, for years, has adopted a policy in editing its search results because they discovered that consumers don't like it when you find a search result and you click, and you find a web page that's just another set of links that's not actually the content you're looking for. And you click on that, and you get to another set of links, and you have to waste all this time before you get to the content you want. And they had created a preference in their search algorithm for links to websites that produce their own content, that don't just reproduce other people's content. Unfortunately, under the DMA, they no longer have the latitude to adjust the results. And even though consumers find that result very promising and very positive, they enjoy it, it's creating a lot of welfare, as a result, the other intermediaries like Booking.com and Expedia are showing up higher on the web page and getting more of the traffic instead of the actual hotels. And so the early evidence suggests that this is a rule. As we all know, all rules have games, around them. They have winners and losers, and they have to be understood. And so there is a direct impact on how individual companies are working. Now, what's always striking to me, that's important, but what's even more important is innovation. In a sense, this is what's happening today, but innovation is what's going to drive growth in the future over and over again. And what I would say is the early returns on the DMA has shown that there's negative impacts on certain innovations that had already been deployed, and even worse impacts on innovations that are new and haven't yet been deployed. So let's talk about the first one. Let's talk about what's happened to Google search results. So if you remember when Google first launched, this is an example I'm motivating off a website that I found saying if you search for hotels Madrid, you're making a trip to Spain, you want to search for hotels. In the original Google of 1995, you just got a bunch of links. And over time, Google has innovated on its search results, where if you search now, you get a map that doesn't just show you hotels, but where are they located, because you know I'm going to be at FGV, I need to know the convenient hotels, where are they? But not only that, what are the dates of travel? How many guests in the room? You know, many different, what are the ratings of it? And you can synthesize, you can put additional criteria and limit the results and get something that's much more closely matched to what you want. And as it turns out, consumers, I don't have to tell you this, they really like this. It makes the functionality much more useful. Now here's the problem. The mapping function is provided by Google Maps. It's an integrated, vertically integrated product. And theoretically, you could create an open API where this could be any mapping product, whether it's, you know, Apple Maps or Bing Maps or anything you want. But that's pretty complicated because the interfaces that they all use are completely different. You also have to integrate this with Google's travel functions to be able to specify this, and you cannot actually vouch for the accuracy or the quality of the other providers. Because when you realize if you're going to do a third-party environment, you have to do a great deal of other testing and validation and add a great deal on top of this. And so what happens is, when you look at this, there's a problem under the DMA, is that if Google builds this functionality across its, by combining its search results with its own proprietary mapping function, which is Google Maps, it violates the DMA prohibition against self-preferencing. You are now giving an advantage to your own proprietary mapping system. So what happens, this is what search results look like in Europe now. If you do Hotels Madrid, it looks like Google used to look like in the late 90s. And so they've had to roll back certain innovations which consumers found extremely beneficial because of the rules. They cannot make it comply with the rules. And there has to be issues about interoperability and other issues that become problematic. So that's on existing innovation. What's perhaps even more concerning is future innovation. We found out that when Twitter became X and really cratered, Meta developed a new product called Threads that took them 8 months to launch it in Europe after they launched it in the US. Because you have to deal with interoperability and all these other concerns that they have to do to comply with the DMA, it caused a delay. Even bigger problem is Microsoft's AI product that they're using to back their search engine Copilot, Apple's AI, has not launched in Europe, and it appears that it may not launch in Europe because it's not clear that they can comply with the interoperability requirements. And that's even before we get into the AI Act, which is, on top of it, another approach that is going to make that even more problematic. I actually have an article that examines it. I actually think that there's no way that most large language models, OpenAI, I don't think can launch in Europe. Not because just of the DMA, but because of GDPR. There's too much personal information that's been trained on, and they can't give notice and rectification and withdrawal and objections to processing and all the functionality that GDPR requires. So we see this type of regulation actually, however well intended, having a negative impact on certain innovations. And in a world, what we find is even entrepreneurs within Europe who had previously started companies say that we're not going to do it here anymore. They've announced this publicly. And the quote that I love is a friend of mine told me, I'm an entrepreneur, I'm a dreamer. The problem with ex-ante regulation is that you have to hire a lot of lawyers before you launch your product, not necessarily after if you get an enforcement action. And he said, if you make me hire a bunch of lawyers before I start to dream, I'll still dream. I'll just do it someplace else. And that's the mindset, which is, and what we learned from the historical U.S. scholarship is regulation is a form of taxation. And that, in fact, it increases the cost of doing business, and that if you put it on there, you will see less businesses that on the margin would have launched all of a sudden can't do it because the costs have gone up. And this is nothing surprising. There's going to be an impact, and it's something we have to take into account in the balance. And you see, there's a wonderful quote by the Ericsson CEO. And to me, Ericsson, they're an equipment company. They're not actually directly innovating. They need companies. They need more traffic to websites so that we need to demand more radios so they'll do it. They're definitely tied to the future of the digital economy. And he says his worry is that Europe will become a museum. That is a place where old things are. Because if new technologies don't deploy there for regulatory reasons, then it'll simply be a place where people bypass. The new technological innovations will bypass. And we're seeing discussions of this globally in other countries we're working on. So what we see here is some early returns where there's concerns about the impact on small and medium-sized enterprises, there's winners and losers in any form of regulation, sometimes not intended, and we see this negative impact on innovation and venture capital. And what's interesting is this is consistent with what we've seen in other areas. We don't really have full-blown academic studies under the DMA because it's too new, but under GDPR, there are very good studies about how venture capital funding is going and how investments are going, and there's pretty good evidence at this point, pretty clear evidence that GDPR has limited the number of investments in new businesses and the amount that's being invested. We also have early returns from China, which has done something that's not quite like the DMA, but again is cracking down on digital companies. We've seen venture capital funding going way off. And what you see is concerns being raised like people, like the chair of the competition committee of the OECD, Frédéric Génie, who is, I love his views. I always think, someone told me, my dean once told me, they like me because they don't know what I'm going to say before I say it, because they take things by the merits. And I think Fred is that way. He's not going to take one side. He's not just going to choose, I'm always going to favor Europe, even though he's French and he was an enforcement official. His concerns is that ex-ante regulation like the DMA is anti-economic and anti-competitive, and he's really worried about how its impact is going to have on consumers and innovation in Europe. And so we see a number of these voices coming out. One of the problems you'll see in Europe is so many of European scholars who I talk to will tell me privately that they think the DMA is a bad idea, but when you put them in public, they will never say that. Because it's a done deal in Europe, so there's no upside in them doing it, and too many of them are dependent on the EU for invitations to conferences, to be able to speak to officials, and even the bigger problem, for funding. A lot of the European academies really depends on study grants from the European Union, and most of them don't dare say publicly what they will tell me privately. And so this is unfortunate. You would think academics, the reason we have independence, that's the whole reason, but that's a problem. Okay. So this is what we've learned from your experience. Let's talk about the frameworks for ex-ante regulation more generally before we talk about it more specifically. And the thing I love about law is that we actually have ways to do this. So, and the funny thing is we think of, a lot of times ex-ante regulation, what is the role? We're all, I think we're all lawyers here. And so the example I always give is torts. Car accidents. How do we govern this? Well, we generally use negligence, which is reasonableness in light of all the circumstances. We've had cars for a long time, but we continue not to use ex-ante regulation for most things. Now, if a person, we do have some small rule-like islands within tort law. If you have a person rear-end you, the person who's in behind, they're liable. That's as close to rule as we get. And so we have this sort of balance where we think sometimes we do rules in advance, and sometimes we don't. The question is, how should we think about it? There has to be a framework, an academic, intellectual, heuristic framework that help us understand when you do one and when you do the other, and then we can have that framework and say, what does that tell us about digital platforms? What does that tell us about AI? Okay, so I think there's two wonderful bodies of law that will act, a legal scholarship that can help us here. So one comes out of antitrust. The default is rule of reason, which is ex post, case by case, the standard approach. But every now and then we do something called per se illegality. We will declare certain practices to be illegal without examining the circumstances, without examining the effects. And we have a set of principles that govern when you do per se illegality instead of rule of reason. There's also a long-standing academic debate between what we call rules and standards. Rules is something like drive no faster than 100 kilometers per hour. A standard would be drive safely under the circumstances. And so what we discover is, as we know, as my tort example gave, there is a body of scholarship that says, so when do we do rules instead of standards? Because rules are really interesting. They say the old line is, standards are easy to write up front, but expensive to apply. Be reasonable in light of all the circumstances. I can say the golden rule. I can tell it to everybody all the time. But then figuring out what's reasonable requires case-by-case adjudication. Rules are expensive to do in advance, but very cheap to enforce. Now the problem is when you set them up in advance, though, you have to really know what you're doing, because all rules draw lines that are more or less arbitrary. So the one rule that I give in my teaching examples, in the US you vote when you turn 18. Somewhere out there is a young person who's 17 years old in 364 days. They won't vote. A person born one day later will. And on some level they'll say, what's the difference between me and this other person? The answer is functionally nothing. So rules draw these sort of rough lines that divide people into two groups, but we have to make sure that the lines are at good places, because if you draw them in bad places, well, you're really going to cause problems, because there's an important key difference across there that you're actually pretending doesn't matter. You're going to have a problem. And so we have to really understand the phenomenon. And this gives us a framework. So one of the things it says is you have to really understand what you're doing before you know how to draw good rules. But in addition, the subject matter has to be homogeneous enough. Why do we have car accidents the way that we do? Because in some circumstances, they change so much, you can't just say, okay, this person wins under this and this person wins under that. Whereas with the rear ending, we can. So we need a homogeneous subject matter. We know a lot very well. But in addition, we need to have a simple inference that the thing we're prohibiting is almost always harmful. And if that's the case, sometimes they're ambiguous and you need a lot more facts, and that becomes a problem. The environment also has to be stable, because if everything's changing, your rules will be obsolete very, very quickly. And in fact, rules, when you take them, if you change them, they take at least 6 months because of due process concerns. But in addition, we also know that legal processes have a political valence. I mean, we try to do the rule of law. One of the problems we have is ventures that have no revenue are extremely underrepresented in legal processes. If you have no money, you can't hire lobbyists. You can't hire advocates. And so we know that there's some biases built into the process. And so when we look at this, and I think about things like the DMA, and I'll talk about this a little bit more when I talk about vertical integration. The DMA is fundamentally about protecting against some forms of vertical integration. They are worried that the platform will favor certain entities, not share information with certain entities. And vertical integration, as I'll point out in another slide, is the quintessential subject matter in the last 60 years we think is actually ambiguous. We used to think it was clearly harmful, and now we believe that it's often good for consumers. And in that case, it's not a great candidate for the simple inferences. It's not homogeneous. It's not stable. And what I hear from Brazil is, unlike in Europe and the EU and the US, where we have a long history of enforcement actions against the big tech companies, there's relatively underdeveloped records about what's happening in Brazil. And and that's important because this environment you see here is very, very different from what you see in the US and the EU. I mean, the players you have are different, and so I think that's very, very important. So when I look at this, I think about this framework is a useful one. It gives us a way to think about it. And I would commend it to Brazil to ask, in this circumstances, does ex-ante regulation make sense for Brazil? And to try to find frameworks that we can use to inform that and how to think about it. My tentative conclusion is it's not the right time. Particularly with AI, I really can't understand why anyone's seriously thinking about regulating AI with ex-ante rules. Because we don't understand that phenomenon at all. Even the people doing it don't know how to make money at it yet. They're all losing money. But at the same time, they're investing tons. It's kind of exactly the behavior you would hope to see for a new technology, but they don't even know how to tap it yet. I subscribe to ChatGPT for $21 a month. There's no way they're making money on this. They're clearly losing. And that's not the value proposition we're going to see. And so understand, and we're going to regulate this now. I don't understand this. I really don't understand this. Okay. So that's the ex-ante regulation in general. What about the DMA? So remember, I said they focus on size. And what I will tell you is we used to do that in the US 60 years ago. And they used to do it all over the world as a result 60 years ago. And about in the 60s and 70s and 80s, we abandoned just looking at size. That is an idea called structuralism. Now, it's funny, the DMA is not just about size. Normally we think about relative size, dominant market share, percentage. But the problem is the DMA, it's not about percentage, it's about absolute size, 45 million users. Now it doesn't matter if that's out of 90 million users, if it's out of 1 billion users, it's 45 billion, it's just too big. And that's a very strange proposition from a competition law standpoint, because we need to know how big that is. But in addition, it's the same size threshold for search engines and social media and e-commerce. And the idea that the relevant threshold will be the same for every e-commerce business, regardless, is very strange to me. That would be the most remarkable coincidence in the world. And so normally, we do more specific analysis than this under competition law. But more importantly, even if we did it based on relative size, we abandoned this idea. We used to have an idea called the structure, conduct, performance paradigm, which is how we did all competition law for a long time. And what we did is we said, well, market performance is what we care about, but it's too hard to measure. So we'll have a model that says certain structure always leads to certain conduct, and that conduct always leads to bad performance. So all we need to know about your market is your structure, and we can infer the bad performance. Okay? And the interesting thing about that model is we don't care what your conduct is. All we need to know is your market share. It's simple. But what we discovered is it's actually often wrong. One we discovered is that scale economies are much more important, and we discovered this back in the 70s and the 80s, and now frankly, in the digital economies, they're even more important. But in addition, we discovered that size is misleading. So first, there's a bunch of economic models we have. Contestable markets taught us that large market share doesn't mean necessarily bad market performance. And Stackelberg price leadership told us that small market share doesn't necessarily mean good performance. And so we realized that we have to know a lot more about the markets than we do. But in addition, what we discovered is that large size is ambiguous in the sense that it can be the result of successful competition on the merits or instead of anti-competitive conduct. You can make the better mousetrap, and you can get dominant market share. So the example that I love, there's two examples I love to give. One is Qualcomm in the 2000s had a proposal about how to do the mobile internet better. The entire engineering community said, that would be great, it's technically impossible. Qualcomm did the technically impossible, what people thought was technically impossible. Guess what? If you do that, you make lots of money. So what's happened is Apple is extremely uncomfortable buying Qualcomm chips. So, and if you look at Qualcomm, they're tiny compared to Apple. You know, Apple's like the third or fourth best, in the top 3 or 4 companies in the world all the time. So they partnered with Intel, the most sophisticated chip company in the world, to try to build an alternative to Qualcomm. They failed. Now, what does that tell us? It's not because they're not capitalized. It's not because they're not motivated. It's not because they're not technically competent. Apparently, Qualcomm is technically better. They're contributing a value that other companies have attempted to do that they cannot. The other example I give is Google Android. Google Android, when it began, had fewer than 10 employees, no revenue, and its ambition was to create an operating system for digital cameras. And if you count the number of people who have a digital camera now, it's kind of a joke. I'm not talking about the one in your phone. Okay, so they then, at this point, they became this fantastic company. It's fantastic, and it's open source. So you can always go back, if you do what Google did, and go back and do it. Amazon did this, they created Fire OS. Now, Samsung and Huawei have Android phones. They're extremely uncomfortable about this. So I said, we'll do what Amazon did. We'll go back to the Linux code. Huawei's been working on a product called Harmony. Samsung's been working on a product called Tizen, their own operating system. They've been working on it for years. Technically good companies, large scale, both have failed. Huawei claims it did, but when you actually look at their code, they actually find out they just copied Android. And so what I see is, okay, what do we learn from that? It's that part of the value of Android, at least, has to be coming from the fact that they're able to solve a problem technically that Huawei and Samsung cannot solve. And if that is the reason that people are adopting Android, that is exactly the kind of good, innovative, pro-innovative competition on the merits that we want to encourage. So what's the solution under traditional antitrust law? Pure size is no longer enough to violate the law. We have a conduct element. It has to be pure size plus some bad conduct. We've gone back to that conduct part of structured conduct performance and understand it plays a critical role. The DMA takes conduct out again. It rolls back the law, what we've learned of 60 years of competition law, and says we're going to go back to structuralism. Now you can do that, but the question is you have to have an answer for the reasons why we abandoned structuralism in the first place. And so far I haven't heard that answer. And so until I hear it, saying unless they know something now that we didn't know then, this seems like a move that has the risk of penalizing good conduct as well as bad conduct, in which case innovation, Pearson is looking to innovate, they'll say, okay, I've got my decision tree, I've got failure, which is 95% likely, and I lose all this cost. I have initial public offering where I make $1 billion at maybe 1% of that, and then the remaining 4%, I merge and I exit. And if you look at this, well, but if I'm too successful, my big success of the $1 billion, I have to take it down to maybe 800 million, because if I do, it's going to go down. And then when you're doing the ex ante decision, your expected value goes down. And the chance of you innovating and deciding whether it's a good idea has to fundamentally change. And so this is what my big concern about this. That's problem number one. The problem number two is what I alluded to earlier, is what we've learned in the last 60 years is vertical integration tends to be beneficial. So the US law used to have a lot of per se illegal rules on vertical restraints. We've slowly moved them all at this point to rule of reason. Why? Because the economic theoretical literature shows vertical integration to be ambiguous. It's sometimes good, sometimes it's bad. Now, theory is where you start, but if it's theoretically it could go either way, we need empirics. The empirical evidence shows that it tends to be beneficial to consumers. So the chief economist during the Clinton administration, her name is Francine LaFontaine. She's done a number of surveys, and the most recent one is retrospectives of vertical mergers that were approved by the US government. And they tried to see, did we do the right thing? Of the 10 mergers that were approved, they found that 4 were good for consumers, 6 were neutral, and 0 were harmful. Now, that isn't to say that all vertical mergers are going to be beneficial, but in inference, we look at the body of evidence, and in the vertical restraints literature, there's like 25 studies that do these. This is out of the peer-reviewed economic literature, which is still our gold standard. Of the 25, 24 were beneficial or neutral. 1 was harmful at the point of 0.1% welfare loss to consumers per year. So they think it's relatively small. And so what we see as a matter of inference, that's why we've abandoned per se illegality, this sort of ex-ante approach in all of vertical integration. And when we look at the whole notion of the DMA, it kind of goes against the way because it presumes that vertical integration is bad, and we lose the kind of innovations like the first one I showed you between Google combining maps with its search function. All right. So, oops, sorry. So there is a trade-off, and we have to think about this. We're going to lose some innovations. Access rules are going to benefit some and against others, and hurt others. There's always going to be games. Compliance costs, always on the margin, are going to hurt innovation. Entrepreneurs may read if it's an international game. Many countries are worried that if they make the rules too tough, people will simply invest elsewhere and deploy elsewhere. And then lastly, startups, and the worries, if the threshold's a problem, you may actually limit your growth or fragment your company intentionally to make sure you don't hit the thresholds. And so there's all these questions that have been raised that we have to wait and see. Okay. I'm running a little longer than I'd like. So there are a bunch of implementation challenges. I'm going to skip over these. But what anyone who's done telecom will tell you is the things they say are easy are not easy. And the tools we have for doing it are very limited. I mean, especially access rights, if the company's not already offering it as a business elsewhere, you're going to make them create new systems to order and provision and meter and bill access to new services they've never offered as an independent business. But in addition, what we've learned is that you can't just do that anywhere you want. But in addition, you're going to have fights. One of the partners in this forced transaction is being forced to do business. They'd rather not be doing business. So they will comply the way I pay taxes. I will do what I'm supposed to do, but I will not give you extra because I feel like I should. I'm a good person, I believe it. You know, and in fact, what you'll find is one party will comply with law, but only just. And so what you'll find is there'll disputes over price. That's to be expected. One person wants to pay less, one person wants to get paid more. Okay, fine. But it's not going to just be price. And what we learned from the essential facilities doctrine and other things, you have to give me cash up front, no credit. You have to give me 90 days notice of any changes. And there's all these non-price terms that get fought over and involved in, and they're enormous problems. Lastly, is we learned that these are extremely difficult to implement, and the more technically complicated, we have cases like Trinco and Iowa Utilities Board in the US that say the more complex the interface, the harder and the more intrusive the regulation is going to have to be. The other nasty little secret we learned from the Microsoft case, and we're learning now from other things, is sometimes remedies are useless. So the remedy to vertically unbundling Microsoft Windows and Internet Explorer was they had to sell a version of Microsoft Windows that didn't have a browser. The demand for that for over a decade was literally zero. Nobody bought it. And you see this now with choice screens in the EU. They now have to ship devices without the search engine picked. They're all still picking Google. And Windows ships with Bing pre-installed, 95% of people switch to Google, even though it takes them time. And so what we see, and we see this with open banking for data portability in the UK, they've got it stood up, even with all the difficulties, people aren't using it. And so in addition to the overhead of administering it, we have to pay attention that this well-intentioned idea often don't work for creating the kind of environment. Mostly, why are people choosing Google on the choice screen? Because they think it's the better product. It's not because they're locked in. It's not because they have sticking additional costs. It's wide open. They could pick anything. And in that case, I talked to some people in Europe and say, well, that's a problem. We're going to have to do something. We're about enabling consumer choice, and if they're choosing what they think the better option, that's traditionally not a problem we think competition law has to address. All right. So to sum up, skipping the implementation slides, there are developments in other countries. Germany, in its competition law, has stayed within the competition law paradigm and has changed certain presumptions and burdens of proof. And so they're actually doing case-by-case ex post. They've stuck to it. It's really interesting. This was pushed by one of the co-authors of the study requested by Margaret Vestager when she was competition commissioner for the EU. She's now vice commissioner of the EU. She asked a legal scholar, an economist, and a computer scientist to write a report. And they endorsed something called the new competition tool, which was very much in the competition law paradigm. If you want to know anyone who's involved in the politics, know that that was working its way through the EU until Orange, the old France Telecom, and Axel Springer, the German content company, went to the vice president of the EU, Thierry Breton, and lobbied him for a change, and 2 weeks later we got the DMA. And the DMA looks nothing like the new competition tool-based legislation we saw before. And unsurprised, one of the things we always wonder is Thierry Breton is a former CEO of France Telecom. So he has a lot of attunement, a lot of political access to certain people. And you look at this, and I think about if I'm another country trying to decide whether to follow the DMA, I also have to look at the unique politics and the dynamics and the fact that I think Europe is openly envious of Brazil in terms that you have good tech companies. You actually have unicorns, particularly in the fintech space. They don't have one. And they're not really worried about the deterrence in a lot of ways because that's not as big a deal. So they're just accessing the monopoly property. Japan actually did a whole industry study on all of the different types of platforms. They've opted not to do any regulation on all of them except for mobile operating systems. So they're doing a DMA type thing, but only for a very limited scope. The UK has gone a completely different direction. They're doing codes of conduct at the company level. I actually think it's an interesting idea. It's more ex post. I don't like the fact that it's company specific, because then if you're one company and there's another company in the same business, one has bigger restrictions than the other. Interestingly, Australia is, according to their competition regulator, they're recommending they follow the UK's lead, but not doing it at a company level, but at a sector level or a service level, so you get uniform treatment across all the different companies doing the same thing. Korea has rejected DMA legislation, although the legislature's changed hands and there's a new proposal. We're trying to figure out so we don't know what's going to happen, but the president is still at this point opposed. The US is often watched. Many people think that there's some chance that we might pass this legislation called ICOA. I'll tell you right now, ICOA is dead. There's just, first, it doesn't have the votes, even with the Democratic Party, which is pushing it, because the California delegation is extremely skeptical of it because of their own personal political reasons. And if you ask me if Kamala Harris gets elected, I think that Silicon Valley will probably be very well represented in her administration. It's just that she's from Northern California. It's just extremely likely. In addition, you see that, and I do think there's no chance of revival. Right now, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee of the House says no. He has no interest. And then lastly, Australia, India, Thailand, Brazil, other countries are trying to figure out what to do. And so I think that we see here a lot of different models, which I think are worth studying. So bottom line, I think there's some real early experience that you can benefit from here in Brazil. It's not all been great. They're trying to see how this works out, but there's reasons for great concern. I do think that we need frameworks for deciding when ex-ante regulation is proper. I do think we need frameworks for understanding when does structuralism make sense, when is vertical integration problematic, and we need to take the 60 years of economic learning and really benefit from them. We need to understand the problems with remedies, and this is where the telecom stuff really kicks in. And I would say the DMA is just one of many approaches, and my general recommendation would be I think Brazil has a great opportunity to learn from the experiments that other countries are doing to see how they're playing out, because even in just a few months of reality of the DMA, we've learned so much about how it's playing out, and I think that Brazil right now has the same opportunity to learn from them as possible, the other countries' examples. All right, and with that, I thank you for your attention.
So thank you so much, Professor Yoo. It was a very amazing presentation, very critical, and about a very complex topic. So now, Leonor, you can be the next one, and we'll get the...
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor. I take your point about Brazil considering legislation, and we thought that would be interesting for you and for those who are not so familiar with the topic to understand more about the debate in our country, and to understand more and to thank you. And to understand the lay of the land here, right? So, and first thing, Professor, in Brazil, nothing is simple, right? So we don't have one ICOA, and we have at least 7 bill of laws discussed in many stages in the Congress in Brazil. And I think it's very important for us in the beginning to put things in the right boxes. Because we have in Brazil content regulation, we have in Brazil artificial intelligence regulation, and we have in Brazil platform regulation. And oftenly we see people mixing up things because they say that for example, they support platform regulation because they think it's important to regulate fake news, for example. And when we go deep in the discussion, we see that these people, they are supporting content regulation, right? So we see this kind of mixed things, confusing things. So just to explain a little bit more, the first 2 bills in Congress, we can not say the first 2, but 2 main bills, 2 main important bills in Congress, they address content regulation. The first one is what we call the fake news bills, the fake news bill. It's designed to combat the spread of false information, introduce measures on transparency and accountability. For companies. We have supporters who think it's important to curb effects on democracy, and we have criticism for those who have concerns on censorship coming from this bill. And the second one is the promotion of plurality and diversity of news. Is more related to news content, and it's the idea of reinforcing national journalism, promoting diversity and news sources, and includes provisions on remuneration of news contents. And we have the second box, which is artificial intelligence, and then we have a main bill that is part of a broader effort to establish the legal framework and for AI, ensuring ethical use, protection of citizens' rights, and promoting innovation. It establishes national standards for development, implementation, and responsibility of AI systems in Brazil. And it's mandatory, and there is some provisions on mandatory risk of evaluation of AI in Brazil. But then we have the 3 last ones, which are more related to platform regulation, right? The third and last box, which are the first one is our Brazilian DMA, as we call, and it was the first big bill of law. And it has been highly criticized because this is what you have just mentioned, a kind of a transplant of foreign regulation. It's some articles are really close to the DMA in Europe. It brings ex-ante rules on transparency and duty of isonomic and non-discriminatory treatment, obligation to grant access. It's a big point in this bill of law. And this is the most antitrust bill, as we can say, right? It's the most conflicting regulation on antitrust and regulation in Brazil. The second one is our digital platforms legal framework. It has been called in this way. It gives a platform, differently from the first one, it gives a platform more autonomy to self-regulate, keeping transparency and reporting on how algorithms work. And it empowers digital platforms to manage their operations while maintaining accountability. So it gives more powers to platforms, but it enforces self-regulation and brings the idea of self-regulation in Brazil. And then the last one is more related to who does what. And then it's a discussion of who should be the authority, and it gives more powers to our telecom agency, Anatel, and to our data protection agency, and empower them to create norms, implement policies, and prevent violation of users' rights. So we have, as you can see, a mix of 3 different boxes, and in platform regulation, 3 different rules, bill of laws, discussing the same topic, and this is what we have in Brazil. But with these words, I turn to Alexandre for his considerations, and thank you very much for coming.
Hi. Not sure it's okay. No, I haven't. So thank you very much, Professor Leonor and Professor Caio, for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. I think that not necessarily to share the perspective of the federal government and of the Ministry of Finance, but share a few doubts and also ask a few questions to Professor Yoo, which was the task I was assigned here. So that's my role in the panel. But I think that I would like to, I think it's important, Professor, I think I'd like to go through what we are doing and how we are trying to deal with this very complex subject of, say, digital economy, digital platforms, and their impact on the organization of economy as a whole. So I think it's beyond doubt that this is very relevant for the economy as a whole. So we have the largest companies ever. They are based on the digital platforms model. So maybe that has something to do with how they work. So what explains this rate of growth, or how did they get so big and so fast? Maybe that has something to do with their business models and how network effects work, how they operate. And some markets, in some cases, you are prone to a tipping effect, or to a winner takes most, or winner takes all dynamics, right? And so given that, and given the debate that's been going on in Brazil for a couple of years, and I think that for a longer time elsewhere, we decided to study the subject and conduct a very much a data-driven approach at the Ministry of Finance. And so what we did was to have a call, to publish a call for subsidies, and to ask a few questions, mostly related to this frontier between traditional antitrust, let's call it that way, and regulation. So what would be the diagnosis here? What are the problems, and what do you need to do in order to move on and to make sure that Brazil has the right tools to promote competition and to ensure sustainable growth in this kind of economy? And that's relevant from the Ministry of Finance perspective, because that also has to deal with a large challenge that we have in the country, which is to foster productivity. We are still laggards in Brazil when it comes to productivity. Our productivity has been stalling for the past 20 years. And on the other hand, what we see when we look at Brazilian platforms is that they're very productive. So local players, you see fintechs, you see ride-sharing apps, and a very wide range of different companies that are based on the model of digital platforms. They're very productive. So they have a relatively low number of employees too, and their turnovers are very significant, and their market values as well. So what we did was to ask those questions. So that on one hand, that's what we did. We had a very significant turnover in the call for subsidies. We had over 70 contributions, some of which are very complete, complex contributions. So people stopped to work on that, and so we are very much grateful for that. So on one hand, we had that, and I'll get back to a few details on a few things that popped up among different contributions. And on the other hand, we decided we also wanted to. We hear a lot about the European approach, about the DMA, about what the EU is doing. So what we thought what we decided to do after connecting with the World Bank and with a few specialists and a few people from academia, and I would like to also to highlight the importance of academia for sound policy building and policy making, and especially the role of legal scholars in trying to find the right tools to deal with those problems. What we decided to do was to also conduct this benchmark study and connect with different jurisdictions. So by connecting with different jurisdictions, we were able to deep dive a bit more on what those other countries are doing. And I think that relates a bit more to one of your final slides, is that, okay, so you do have one more rigid approach, which is the EU DMA, but there's also a variety of approaches when we look at what Australia is preparing to do, when we look at Japan and the new bill, which I think it has already passed. So it's about to be implemented in Japan, right? So they had the Transparency Act, and now they have the mobile ecosystems legislation. When we look at Germany, the UK, South Africa, India, which is another BRICS country, India, which has a very vibrant digital economy, many relevant digital players in India. India is maybe we'll move ahead with also some kind of legislation, which even seems to me that has a lot to do with the principles of the DMA. But I mean, apart from the DMA, if we zoom out here, we see that there's a lot going on, but you have different solutions, but there could be, what we see here, there's a trend between government, legislators, and competition authorities to try and build new tools to cope with those very specific challenges posed by how the complexity of those ecosystems and how market power emerges in them, right? So I think that's something that is being done either way. So maybe there are more rigid approaches, maybe there are more flexible ones, but it seems that the practice when it comes to competition and to antitrust, there's a shift, and somewhere between traditional antitrust and regulation, there are different possibilities here. So I think that's first of all one aspect that I would like to hear from you and to ask you. How do you see this trend apart from the DMA? So what's the movement here? What are we perceiving, and how can we benefit from having entered a bit later in these discussions? Because I think from this perspective is good, because we managed to have relevant data points. And on the other hand, when it comes to the local discussion, and that's what I'm mentioning here is what appeared in some of the contributions, some of the very well-written and well-built contributions that we have received as food for thought and as input for policy making, is that on one hand, we have, and just one relevant data point is that we did have the many international players taking part in the call for subsidy. So the majority of participants are not from Brazil. So that's an interesting data point. The majority are either companies or fintechs or research centers. They are based or headquartered in the US. So that's relevant. So we have managed to also to build this connection and this dialogue with something that I think it's a global matter, right? So when it comes to what happens is some of the, especially tech companies and a few of the large tech platforms, what they presented to us was an argument saying basically that, okay, what we have today in Brazil is more than enough. So we have a competition law that could be flexible enough to deal with new challenges such as defining market powers, such as defining relevant markets or different kinds of control that the antitrust agency could already use. On the other hand, we have CADE, so the antitrust agency, the competition authority in Brazil, they presented a contribution written by and signed by all of the commissioners, saying that we need to have additional tools and we need legislative reform. So not necessarily arguing for an ex-ante approach based on the DMA, at least from what is in their contribution, but saying that something needs to be done because market power emerging from network effects in those ecosystems is flying under the radar. So basically that's what they're saying there. And when we look at other players, other relevant companies represented by fintech associations, app developers associations, and so on, I think there's a variety of approaches here of what they have been arguing for. But most of them are complaining a lot about mobile ecosystems, you know. So I think that's a very pressing subject, because today app stores and how you and the rules to develop apps, and I think that there are some aspects of those mobile ecosystems that are very much relevant for those players that are very productive in Brazil, you know, so for them to move ahead. So I think that those are some of the pieces that we have on the table right now while we are moving forward with this diagnosis and to think on how to better move forward in Brazil. But in that regard, I think that what I would like to complement is that, so how first, when zoom out, how can we better use this global trend towards innovation and towards building this environment in Brazil in which we can sustain competition and pave the way for progress? Because, so I think that's one question, and the other one is, on one hand, so the DMA, we have like this more rigid approach, but yet, even though there are consequences, but you have more legal certainty on one aspect. On the other hand, you have flexibility and greater degrees of flexibility. So how to deal with this flexibility? Because what other jurisdictions are doing is that they are giving more powers to competition authorities. That's what's happening in Japan. That's what could happen in Australia. That's what's happening in Germany and also in the UK. So how to deal with flexibility and this more and this approach. I think that's a bit of that's the perspective I wanted to bring here, and also the questions. And maybe you maybe you could help us also find the right solutions here. But I think that's the perspective I wanted to bring to the table here. So, and thank you.
Professor, the idea is to turn for everyone, and then, okay. So now Roberta Rios, that is the Government Affairs and Public Policy Manager at Google.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me here. I'm Roberta. I'm a political scientist. I'm not a lawyer. So, and the mother of a 5-year-old girl, an amazing 5-year-old girl. And I have been passionate about competition issues and technology for the past few years. I have worked with Professor Eleanor and Caio in this. And we have seen the discussions around the European DMA over the past few years. And the actual implications of it, we're starting to see just now, as Professor Yoo just told us. And one thing is that the theoretical and political discussion is on one side. But the way how it affects people's lives and how people are dealing with this. We cannot disconnect antitrust impact on society. As Ale was saying, like, we have a shift not only on the legislation, but on the models and the way the world lives around the internet. And we're talking about tech companies, and I'm working at tech companies. So this has shifted. And we are seeing this, how to comply, how to discuss, and how to regulate as well. And now we have AI, Gen AI, that has moved this even faster on the last 2 years. And it will continue to change. With other revolutions, we don't even have the idea, as Professor also said, like, we don't know where AI is going. We do need to adjust our regulations. Of course, if the world's changing, you have to change the regulations as well. Legislation, whatever, can impact people's lives. But we do need to do it responsibly and not focusing on company A or B today. Because, like, Google is a huge company today. It could not be tomorrow. And you're focusing on companies. You're not focusing on the outcomes to the citizens and to society. we all have been using the DMA example because it's the one that I think has most changed this dynamic when we're discussing antitrust and competition. And I won't get on the technical part of it. Professor already did, and I think most of you are tired of hearing as well. But DMA is a new and high-risk approach to competition policy. And it's chilling innovation in Europe. It's already doing it. And we have like 4 months of the legislation like out. We had like 2 years to comply, and the organizations adjusting, the government adjusting, EU creating the new, like the way they were gonna make the companies present the reports and everything, but really applying, it's been over 4 months. And the numbers the professor brought was similar to what I was gonna bring, because other sectors are feeling the effect on them. So we are not able anymore to show maps on search for anything. And what we have been seeing is that customers are trying to go around it and install VPN on their computers, so search continues to appear, and they continue to have the experience in Europe. And there are forums, you go online, and we have been collecting data to like contribute on government discussion and Congress discussion, and we found this out. Like, people continue to want that experience. And they are trying to find ways to do it if they cannot do it on the traditional path they used to do. The thing about the DMA is that it puts the interests of commercial rivals ahead of consumers and other ecosystem players. When we're talking about digital companies, we're not only talking about Google, Meta, and Apple. We're talking about a whole ecosystem of it, of small, medium companies as well. And although they are not under the DMA legislation, the impacts on them are like collateral. And then the consumers in the end are feeling these harmful effects. My point here is, what was the approach that was made when implementing the legislation? It was not antitrust-proof actions that would hurt the consumer, but instead target the companies without fully assessing the consequences. That's the main point. Like, they want to target A or B today. Like, who knew what TikTok was 5 years ago? If the DMA hadn't been in place 5 years ago, TikTok wouldn't be part of it in Europe. ByteDance wouldn't be in it. And if the DMA was in place 20 years ago, Europe would not have smartphones today, because smartphones were built vertically integrated. And although, for example, we have the browser, like Apple has its browser, many of us that use iPhones use the Chrome browser from Google, although they do have it. The same thing with Microsoft. When you're in computer, you can have their browser, but you can choose to use a different one. And this is something that is different from previous like discussions around antitrust and competition. In the past, like if a company is questioning its rival, you would have to go, like, you can change the store, you have to go physically, you have like, people had to move to make these decisions. Today, in digital ecosystem, you only have like to click. It's like 2 clicks away, and you can get out of Chrome and get into Safari, for example. It's much easier. So how do we regulate this? It's complex, and that's a question to Professor, like, and it's really connected to what Ali was saying. Like, how do we try to regulate in a way, but in the end, from my point of view, like the user's choice is even bigger than we used to have. And antitrust policy has to be designed to increase competition among firms for the benefit of the consumers who enjoy better products and lower prices. People want direct access to information and richer, more advanced product features. And the DMA is designed to roll back those advances, seen as harmful. So I imagine, on the other hand, like, I imagine everyone here heard about and saw the US decision on Google a couple weeks ago. And this actually reinforces my point. Despite what many of you might imagine, we already have antitrust legislation in place that can overlook competition issues, including the digital ecosystem. We don't know the outcomes yet on the decision in the US, and we were discussing this previously, so it has a lot of ways. But the US case shows us there is no need to new regulation. And if countries understand that they need to change something, you can improve their own legislation. You don't have to create a whole new system for it. And this is the case of Brazil as well. Like, CADE is recognized as a serious competent institution, globally speaking. We do have a strong legislation. Do we need to copy something from other countries? And I'm not saying, again, that we don't have to review our own law and make improvements. I think this is part of the construction and part of the changing in the world. But today, in Brazil, I don't see a real problem that requires a totally new approach from our policymakers. And every time we're discussing this, and when I'm talking to people that advocate for, like, importing the EU example and everything, I ask, what is the problem with the Brazilian legislation? Where is the flaw in it? How don't you see? So, and they cannot answer the question because they don't even know as well. And we know in Brazil, the pressure came, as it did in Europe, from the telcos. And the bill, one of the bills that Leonor just showed us, like, puts Anatel as the body that would oversee, including competition for digital platforms, which doesn't make sense if we have CADE that has been doing this for the past years. So it's undeniable that we are in this pressure. And I think that, to conclude and ask Professor Yoo another question, is that we have many examples around the world. Of course, we talk more about the DMA, and we see the US that has not passed a new legislation, but still is overseeing and judging the companies, including Google, so recently, in Brazil. So how do you see these decisions from other markets influencing our competition environment in Brazil? And what could we do when discussing this potentially new legislation or alteration in our law today that we could do to preserve the interest and focus on the consumers to their benefits and not focusing on companies A or B? Thank you.
Now we're going to turn to Guilherme Ribas, director from Embraque and also partner at Tosini Freire.
Thanks, Leticia. Thanks for organizing this event, and Leonor and Caio for having us here with this great audience. And it's a pleasure to have Professor Yoo here. My suggestion is that we lock the door and don't leave. He cannot leave the building until he answers all our questions. Which are many, as you can see, Professor. First of all, on behalf of EBRAC, I have here the digital markets officer of EBRAC, our think tank in Brazil, of competition lawyers and economists. And he asked me to tell everyone that you are invited for our digital markets seminar. It will be on September 12th. Everyone is invited to be here in São Paulo. And Professor, thanks a lot. I think there are many things to reflect based on what you said. I have some reactions in relation to what you said. First, I really want you to spend a couple of minutes to develop a little bit about the challenge in implementation, because I think this is, as Roberta mentioned, the way the users are doing to using other forms to access Google's platforms all over the world to check what they want. So I think it's a reflection that implementation is not working very well. And I moderated this year in Brussels in a conference of the International Bar Association, a panel about implementation, the challenges, and you have your colleague from London, Roberta Olivier Battier, who is antitrust, the chief of the antitrust lawyers in Europe, and the head of the DMA unit. And they were talking about the debates, and the bureaucrat, the regulator, was very happy, satisfied that the implementation process has been handled by engineers from both sides. And I was so shocked about her happiness with engineers discussing the way the implementation is going on, and we see in your examples what's this decision has led. Another point that I think it's important for us, Leonor mentioned our DMA bill in Congress. It was sponsored in the first moment by the communications agents, and also as a result of the fair share debate, dispute between carriers and big techs. Apparently, it was the carriers gained the first rounds of the battle and put this bill. And CADE was, in this first moment, very reluctant in having a regulation. And we have been seeing CADE since the beginning of the first speeches of Commissioner Verstappen in Europe, very, very against regulation in the market. And for many years, CADE was the strongest voice against this kind of regulation. And surprisingly for us, very recently, and we can see in the public consultation organized by Alexandre's team, CADE is now in favor of the regulation, which is a little bit shocking for everyone who has been following our antitrust regulators' speeches all over these years. So my question to you, and this has to do with our initial conversation here, is how you know regulators from all over the world. You were with CADE a couple of days ago. You have been talking to them. What are they thinking? Are they worried that they are losing the boat because Europe is much ahead? And it's not, as you clearly saw here. What's your view on what's going on in this bureaucratic world of regulators? And finally, one question is about this decision in the US of Google. The decision from what, it's a long decision, hundreds of pages, but all the time the judge emphasizes how Google was important for innovation, and so it appears to us that we have a conflict, and regulators, judges are not finding a reasonable environment to deliberate about this. The innovation and the tools and challenges we are discussing here. Thank you very much, and please stay with us until the end of the day at least.
Thank you so much. Now it's Caio Mario's turn. He's a professor here at FGV.
Thank you very much, Leticia, and thank you, Leonor, for organizing this event and for bringing Professor Yoo to talk to us. Professor Yoo, welcome to FGV again, and it's a pleasure to have you here and have this conversation. Alexandre, Roberta, Ribas, always great to talk to you. So I'll just very briefly address, I think, two issues that are already on the table that I'd like to hear more about your thoughts, Professor Yoo, on this. I think one is about the different approaches, right, beyond DMA. I think you made a very detailed case about limitations and problems with the DMA, and especially with very strict rules, little flexibility and potential impact on innovation and other potential benefits from digital platforms. But as Alexandre was mentioning, I think Ribas also mentioned these other approaches. And specifically, I think, when you get out of very strict, detailed rules and you have more flexibility, right? And you mentioned that in your last slide, and I'd like to hear you more about that and about when you embed, for instance, the efficiency defenses on these frameworks. So the German 19A has the potential for justifications, so companies can present justifications that will exempt them from certain prohibitions. And also the DMCC has the possibility of countervailing benefits exemption as well there. So it is a rule-based system, much more flexible than the DMA, because these rules are either in code of conduct, or in the case of Germany, they can be chosen in this preset of potential prohibitions. But also it allows for the same type of arguments that appear many times in antitrust, right? On efficiency, defenses, and things like that. And as you mentioned, I think what is happening really is some shift of the burden of the proof, right? Especially in Germany, that's exactly what they're doing to a large extent. So how do you see those approaches, right? I mean, it's not as strict as DMA. It is open for certain flexibility and how that goes. And the other point that's also pointed out, I think, both by Roberta and Guilherme Ribas, is about the institutional location of powers here in these different models, right? So we do have this debate in Brazil about CADE, the Competition Authority, and the Telecom Authority, which one is and they're both saying, well, I'm the best one to be, if there is any regulation, I'm the best one to be the regulator. There are other discussions as well about the Data Protection Agency, and other discussions about having a completely different one, right? So you have discussions all over on these issues, and you do have a lot of work on telecoms, right? And the pitch of the telecom regulator is really about, well, I have the experience on telecom infrastructure, and therefore this is very close. It's very similar to telecom. CADE's pitch is really saying, no, it's not very similar to telecom. This is actually different. This is not about essential facilities. This is not about infrastructure bottlenecks. This is totally different. I mean, the dynamics of digital markets is totally different. So I'd like to hear you on that as well, given all the background on telecom, which I think is a super important matter as well on the table here in Brazil. So thank you very much. It's really good to have you here.
So thank you so much, all the panelists. I'm gonna, it's gonna be quickly. I'm gonna turn for the public for us to have like 2-3 questions to make the life of professor more challenge. So if anyone have any doubt, like and want to share anything, just be free. Don't be shy, please.
Never shy.
Yeah. You need to ask the opposite. Thank you, Professor, for coming. A great presentation. Good to hear you contesting some of the bases that many times we go through and we don't think about that. So it was pretty useful to hear your speech today. I have basically 2 questions. The first one, you mentioned that DMA, when it comes to the discussions related to DMA, most of the people talk about contestability. There's also another word that people use a lot, which is fairness. And we've been hearing some debates or some speeches on these two words, basically saying that it's not about competition as a whole. It's focused on ecosystems. So when you have one ecosystem, people need to have rules how to deal with that specific ecosystem, or the ecosystem should have rules how to deal with that different users and different sites. And the DMA would be the moderator of this ecosystem. I would like to hear a little bit your reaction on this. And the second point is about industrial policy. There's a very interesting book from Annie Bradford. She deals a little bit with this issue. But what we've been hearing is that Europe took a decision to have a regulation, and is a technology industrial policy to say we want to make these companies less efficient because we want to raise European companies to deal with the American companies. And you mentioned in the beginning of your speech saying that well, if you see data and if you see evidence and you are against those evidence, maybe it's a political issue. What do you think about these two different issues? Thank you.
Any other question? No?
Hi, I'm Arthur. I'm a research fellow here at FGV, and I have a question of how we deal with a pro-innovation bias in this debate. We are saying that all innovation is good, and this is not the case. Yeah, and actually people are against some kind of innovation. So this is my whole issue here, and especially big tech. So.
That's it? Everyone is okay, Professor? It's your time.
Not an easy job, right?
So, well, professors don't mind difficult jobs, and if the answer is I get to talk, that's always a good thing from a professor's standpoint. The problem is not getting us to talk. The problem is getting us to shut up. So I mean, so what do I say? Okay, so to start with, just more or less in order, just because that's how I wrote them down. So we see large companies, they grow big so fast, and what I have to say is, I actually think that the fact they grew up so fast has been a bit of a problem. Just because I think that all companies have to grow up a little bit. They go through a maturation. So the big tech companies in the US used to take great pride in the fact they did not have a DC office for years. And they were the garage innovator. They were the new kid on the block. And this reminds me actually of the US cable industry. The US cable industry was started in individual cities challenging what had been a decades-long, nearly century-long triopoly of big broadcasting companies. And they were small, family-owned, and they thought of themselves as cowboys in the Wild West. And there was some truth to that. Now Comcast is not cowboys in the Wild West. And so they have this whole intellectual crisis because they still think of themselves that way. But I think that they're slowly growing to understand that their role is different. Look, when you're a new startup, you can say move fast and break things. When you're Facebook and what you're breaking is so critical to so many people, that's not okay anymore. And I think the companies have been a little bit slow, but are now finally coming to understand that, well, I keep thinking, the Microsoft outage that took out all the airplanes about a month ago, and all these big single point of failure crashes we're seeing are little wake-up calls. Now, it's funny, I was in India, which was one of the worst, giving talks about this exact topic, coming home the day that big thing happened, and India was the most affected. And so what happened was I was flying back on United, we had no problems. Two reasons. One, United has significant numbers of its computers on Linux. So they're not completely dependent on Windows. And second, all of their gate agents, instead of relying on the equipment there, were able to download apps on their phones running on Android or iOS and scan my boarding cards in, whereas other companies were having to handwrite boarding passes. And so this is partly a design issue. I would think that there's some growing up we have to do, and there's some bad design that we've seen, and whatever you can say, but this was not a competition law failure. This is business failures. If you rely on a technology, you should always have a backup. You should always have plans, and there's parts of this that I think needs to grow up. But the funny thing is, we do see these big companies. One of the things I used to do when I began to teach this class is I used to put up the top 10 companies by market cap, decade by decade by decade. And we forget that, in fact, Google's only been around since 1995. Facebook's been around since about 2005. And Apple, until Steve Jobs came back, was on the verge of bankruptcy and was saved by the iPod, which no one has anymore, right? And so, I mean, it's interesting. So this is a really interesting, and when I started teaching in the academy 25 years ago in 1999, everyone was upset about America Online. And America Online, I think, was sold for $70 million recently. I mean, it's a very, and they were all worried about the access point was AOL keywords. It sounds like a joke now, but it's just, and MySpace was the monopoly. So, I mean, it's an interesting world, and when I think about this, they've seen a lot of change, actually. And a time where we think, the giants will be in place. I would say that Google tried to kill Facebook with Google Plus and about 4 other forms of social media. Apple tried to push Apple Maps. Google is trying to push travel. There's a lot of things they're trying to do. They wish it were so easy. But in the meantime, we get Airbnb, we get Netflix, we get Uber, we saw all these, and they had the option to sell out, and they chose to stay independent. It's a much more interesting space. And so I think, to try to there's an attempt to demonize companies because they're bad, they're big. The question is not that they're big, the question is why? What have they contributed to it? Now, one of the things that you said, and we actually talked about this before, so you already know, one of the things that's interesting is we talk about what's different about the digital economy. And they often talk about network effects. And there's a move in a lot of competition circles that say network effects equals winner take all equals market failure, so therefore just say network effects and we have a competition law problem. If you go to the literature on network effects, you'll find that's not true. So first, we talked about tipping. And this is what we talk about, excess friction, that if you get an installed base, it doesn't change often enough. If you read the actual economic literature, they say it is actually possible to have excess momentum as well as excess friction. That is, you're changing too fast rather than changing too slow. And that's really interesting because, I mean, if you really want the really simple version of this academically, the whole notion of excess friction is based on an idea of what we call network externalities. We know if a conduct you have creates benefits for other people that you don't internalize. I'll say this will cost me $100 to do it, I'll get $100 and I'll get $90 in benefits, I'm not going to do it. But if it created $20 in benefits for other people, the social benefit is actually $110, which is bigger than the $100 cost. Society wants me to do it. And so the problem is, by joining a new network, I'm increasing the value of the new network, but I don't gain any benefit from it. So sometimes I won't change, even though it would be socially beneficial for me to change. So there's 2 problems with this. One, that in network, when you join a new network, yes, you create more value, but that's why companies give you discounts to new subscribers. They actually give you part of the value and let you internalize it. We can solve that problem very easily. But the more interesting theoretical problem is there's a second externality we ignore, which is at the same time I'm increasing the value of the network I join, I'm reducing the value of the network I leave. So there's a cost I'm imposing on other people that I also don't bear. And I don't take into account in my calculus. And so the problem is, if the costs I'm creating for the people I'm leaving exceed the benefits to the network I'm joining, I will join too quickly, even though it's not socially beneficial for me to do so. And what they will tell you is, you can't just say network effects equals failure, because it's an empirical question of which of these 2 effects dominates. That's item 1. Item 2, there are a lot of individual devices we can use that can cause network effects not to lead to market failure. The easiest one is what we call multi-homing, and the other one is gateways. So multi-homing is the easiest one to understand in the context of the Microsoft case. Everyone said, Microsoft has an operating system, that's a monopoly. They have a browser, and they're going to make Java, which is the magic we use on the programmability language on top of browsers, used to be a universal language. They were making Windows-specific, Microsoft-specific Java. So it wouldn't run on any other browser, so you had to use Internet Explorer. And once they tie them together, everyone buys the operating system, everyone gets the Windows browser, that people will all write Java for only the Windows browser and they win the browser wars. Well, empirically, I'll tell you, they did not win the browser wars. That's very clear. But why? Because I have 4 browsers on my computer. Because sometimes some of them don't work. They get behind, and I actually am not crazy about Chrome because of its privacy policies. And so, but I will use all 4 at different times. So it's not one or the other, winner take all. It's I switch like this. And if I need another browser, I get one in 60 seconds or less on one click. And so when you see devices like this, or a gateway between 2 networks, I'm not choosing this network or that network. If there's a bridge between the 2, I can get access to everybody either way. And so what you see is there's only certain market structures that lead to market failure. And in fact, there are times where you see non-interoperability as the optimal outcome. Very simple model by Joe Farrell and Garth Soloner, who wrote the early work on network effects. Imagine you have 2 kinds of consumers. Consumers, Group A and Group B. Group A prefers standard 1, network 1. Group B prefers network 2. Group B has a choice. They can stick with network 2, which is configured the way they like, or they can join network 1, which allows them to be part of a bigger network because it's got all of the A subscribers. There's your network effects. But they have to join the style of network 1, which is less valuable to them. This is a trade-off. If the difference in value between 1 and 2 is big enough, you don't join network 1. It's a question of heterogeneity of consumers and technologies, and if you get enough consumer heterogeneity and technological heterogeneity, you can solve network effects. The effect is 2 producers stay in the market indefinitely, and it's not winner take all. And you start to see these sorts of things, which we've seen in policy, we've seen in antitrust cases, and it becomes a much more interesting analysis that lends itself more to the kind of case-by-case analysis traditionally associated with antitrust. You can't just say simply network effects equals market failure, and that we have to actually do the work that we normally do. The second thing I would say, the other thing is, there's a wonderful question going on right now about innovation. And this is somebody talking about the question of optimal innovation. And there is such a thing, it's funny, when especially dealing with complex technologies, there is such a thing as innovation that's too fast and too much. We know this from what we call patent races, but also, one of the things you see in open source software, the engineers love fiddling with it, but every time they fiddle with it, everyone's got to make changes to Linux, and all the things that they deal with. And at some point they're saying, hey, unless it's a big enough value in the change, don't do it. I mean, it's just, there's a trade-off that sits in all of this. But what's interesting is, there's a question, I take the question, innovation may not always be good things. Innovation is costly, and if the benefits it creates isn't big enough. On the other hand, innovation generally is more beneficial because, 1, its benefits are iterated over time. You leverage them and amortize over time. But the big issue to me is, existing antitrust law is about allocative or static efficiency. And so for those, do you have to take economics to be an FGV law student? Yeah. Okay. So if a standard economic analysis is what we call the production possibility frontier, which is you have the simple model is 2 goods, say guns versus butter or the things we do, and you have technology that allows you to pull all your budget towards guns, all the budget towards butter, and something in between. And normally we assume it's concave this way, because it's not like it's a one-to-one trade-off. You can get some benefits from the other, and you try to get the point that's out there. That's the farthest, anywhere along that curve is fine, and you pick it. And static efficiency is about making sure you're along the production possibility frontier. Innovation is about pushing that frontier out. So it's not just dividing the pie, it's making the pie bigger. And assuming that the benefits of that exceed the cost, this is how we increase productivity, this is how we increase GDP, this is how we increase per capita. This is the magic that makes it all happen. So we do have our thumb on the scale for innovation. So I was at a conference in GW, and there's an innovation economist named David Teese. He's a Berkeley economist, very well known, and he's written papers that I've admired since the 80s, and they've had whole symposia dedicated to the 10th anniversary of these pieces. And he's actually approached me because he's developed a very interesting theory, which is how we're thinking about terms of price competition and quantity. If we're really talking about innovation competition, what should we be looking at? And when we're talking about upward pressure on price and all these tools we have, he's really thinking like upward pressure on innovation. You know, maybe what we should be looking at is not what you're doing in pricing. If the merger, one way is to look at what it does on price and quantity, what does it do to your innovation levels? And if we're really interested in innovation, how would we completely redesign competition law to think about things fundamentally differently? He's asked me to develop this with him, and I'm pretty excited about it. And I think that even though there's probably going to be some balance between the two, this is a really interesting exercise because the economists have been terrible about developing us innovation models. And so we've got to do, the chance to think about this. The economy is different. We used to just, compete on price in markets when we're really talking about pushing this out, and that's the race. It can be Schumpeterian, maybe not. There's all these things we talk about. It is potentially something very, very different. And that I think is what drives a lot of this, is that we see these big frontier, discontinuous changes in productivity. It's pretty exciting. Now, the funny thing is when I think about this is we're talking about mobile operating systems. I always think that we lose a sense of history. If we had this conversation in 2005, we'd be having the same conversation about an operating system that had 70% of the global market share. Its name was Symbian, and it sat on BlackBerry. Okay? And so if we're concerned about access and contestability, we'd be blasting them open, and what would we do? If I'm not going to ask you, but I doubt there's a single BlackBerry user still in the room. Okay? What Apple did is they took a category that was getting sleepy, dead, under BlackBerry and Palm, and ignited the biggest source of GDP growth of any sector in the last 20 years by creating a new capability. And yes, they're making a lot of money off of it. All right? And that's how this works. That's the only reason this works. And so when I think about that, the timing matters, and it's not just what you're doing today, and this is what innovation, it's what's coming next. To the credit of the US court that looked at the Time Warner AT&T merger. This is, AT&T controlled a lot of video distribution channels. Time Warner controls HBO, CNN, a lot of video channels. And the US government brought a case to block it, even though it was under the Trump administration, mostly because Trump hated the Time Warner because he hates CNN, because CNN criticizes him. And anyone who criticized him he didn't like. They lost the case, as many of us predicted. Now, the reason they lost the case is really interesting. Part of it is they looked at the history of cable regulation. Part of it is they said, what is the future of video? And if you look at the way my kids are, it's over-the-top video distribution. No one under the age of 50 has a cable subscription anymore. And they said, regardless of what's in the past, let's look to the future and what this market's going to look like. And the choke point those firms had on that is disappearing before our very eyes. That's interesting. We have to look for, and I see this in the Google case. Now, the Google case that was just decided. We don't know what the future of search is. But search used to be based on past searches. It's now being based on large language models. Large language models are not trained on past search data, which helps the incumbent. ChatGPT-2 is based on Reddit data. ChatGPT-3 is based on Wikipedia data. The only things that have the scale to train large language models is public data scraped from the internet. What we're seeing now is the basis for training a search model is different from something that's proprietary to something that's publicly available. And in addition, people are bypassing search altogether and using LLMs as their search engine instead. Well, that's a possible world. We don't know if that's going to happen yet. The court kind of discounted it. But we could be having a very different conversation even 5 years from now, certainly maybe 2. And so this is a question we have to think about constantly, and this is why the innovation matters. We can't be fighting the last war. We have to be thinking, the world is changing before our very eyes, some areas faster than others. But it's pretty clear AI's got a lot of potential. And so we got to think about this in a much more dynamic sense. And if we ask about tools, that's the tools we need, is to start thinking about counterfactuals and the way we're modeling this and to try to make this all go. What do I see? I do see successful cases. One of the things that is really interesting to me about one of the most vigorous enforcement agencies here on the competition law side is Andreas Mundt and Bundeskartellamt. You talked about the politics of this. They were going to set up a new digital agency in Germany. And Andreas Mundt didn't want to, they hate losing control of things. The whole reason you want an enforcement official is you got to have stuff to enforce. He had to prove to the people in Germany, the politicians, that he could do it. And he brought what I know he won in front of the ECJ and people disagree with me. I think he brought out what I think is a terrible case, okay? He brought a case penalizing Facebook for violating privacy law. And even though they have a privacy enforcement agency who has remedies to get violations of privacy law. So the problem I worry is we shouldn't turn routine violations of privacy law into an antitrust case. We only care about violations of privacy law when they affect markets. You know, the old line that when I teach antitrust, okay, you have, I'm making whatever, shoes, and I'm mad at my competitor. I take a bomb and I blow up their factory. What I've done is probably a business tort, almost certainly a crime. Is it an antitrust law violation? If there's 10 other factories, we're not hurting the market at all. The other 9 factories will pick up the slack. So the answer is it's not enough to have a bad act. You need to have an effect on a market. And if you have effective privacy law enforcement, which Germany does, I don't get why you need to step in here. It's like routine fraud. Okay, we'll turn that into an antitrust violation. Fraud happens. It's a bad thing. It rarely affects markets. And so there's a real interesting question here about the politics, all these people jockeying for position. Now, whoever agency wins, and I actually think the antitrust has been relatively effective at this, they need more funding. If you look at the funding they get as a percentage of GDP, it has not grown. They need completely different staff. They need data scientists who are very expensive. They need psychologists to understand, not just in theory, but like human-computer interaction. And they're starting to hire them in different places, but this is a radically different configuration. And I do think we need to experiment with new analytical tools to try to understand these. I don't think, personally, if someone mentioned market definition and market dominance is a huge problem. My first paper I wrote on broadcast television, which seems like a bad joke in the US now. But that's a classic market where the market looks almost exactly like search markets do and social media markets do. Why? You have an unpriced viewer who back then technically couldn't pay for subscriptions. We didn't have the capability. And we had a market that was acquiring content and getting revenue through advertising. So we looked at oligopoly advertising cases, which were brought. We looked at oligopsony content acquisition cases, and this is fairly normal to me. And that if you look at this, the line I tell my privacy students, if you're getting a product for free, you're not the customer, you're the product. Why? They're selling access to you. This is an advertising market. And we can analyze them as such pretty easily, although there are some bells and whistles about network effects and different things which we need to build on, but we've got, that's just normal science. We're just pushing out the frontiers as we go. What else would I say? The interesting thing, we also mentioned mobile apps. There's a wonderful set of empirical questions for me. So we have these restrictive environments, and there's some empirical questions to me where the fact that the anti-fragmentation agreement requires certain things, and the mobile application developer agreement, I think they've changed the names, requires certain things. One of the things they require is that every phone that calls itself an Android phone has to have a clock. That's what the anti-fragmentation agreement says. It doesn't have to be Google's clock, it has to be a clock. It has to be configured a certain way. Why is this important? If app developers don't know that, every single one's gonna have to write their own clock. Because they can't depend on this general service provided by the app, by the phone, the operating system, and the satellite stuff. I think that's a good thing. Especially if doesn't have to be Google's clock. The mobile application developer agreement does require it to be Google's clock, if you sign that. But you're allowed to sideload other things too. And so my phone, I have an Android phone, I use Samsung's internet browser. It came preloaded. Yeah, Chrome's preloaded too. I've got them both sitting there. It's the exclusivity arrangements that would bother me more. If sideloading is cheap and easy, it's much less of a problem. Now, but on a much bigger level, think about the politics and the economics around the market of Android versus iOS. Apple was hammering Google about what it called fragmentation. Okay? And this is what causes the anti-fragmentation agreement. In Apple, because they own everything, there's only 3 versions of Apple iOS in deployment pretty much at any time. There's the dominant one, there's a handful of legacy stuff they haven't gotten rid of yet, and there's the new cutting edge stuff that's very small, but basically they've got one primary one and a little bit of trailing and a little bit of emerging Apple versions. They don't have to worry about builds. And they only have to worry about one screen size, one radio, one camera. They don't have to support all the general stuff. Android is open source and is open. So the problems are, first, there are 10 versions of Android in current production by mobile phones. Why? Some people built a build around Android version 1, and they don't want to spend the expense for updating to the modern versions despite all the bells and whistles. So everything you do has to be reverse compatible, not just with a couple generations, but all the way back. It is a fragmented environment. And second, you think about the number of screens and other things they have to support. They have to create these incredibly general things based on whether the screen is fat and wide or skin and narrow, and make it work for all of them. There's a huge amount of expense. And actually, you have to have huge testing to make sure they all fit. I think about modularity, Legos. The Legos have to fit together. And these aren't just shapes, they actually have information they pass. They have to agree that they pass it in the right way and that they respond to errors in the same way, and there's a whole bunch of stuff you have to do. And guess what? So I think this is a great world. We have one vertically integrated world where people get the uniform user experience. My students love Apple even though it's much more expensive because of certain things you get. And you have another world which is open source and has all these different things. And the world to me is consumers are best off when they have a choice between the two. I wouldn't want them all to be vertically integrated. I wouldn't want them all to be open. And from a business standpoint, if your first entrance is closed, you go open. If the first one's open, you go closed. Why would you do a Me Too business model? That's a suicide. Now, if you're going to have an open business model, you're going to have to do some things to throw non-compliant applications out. You're going to have to do things to validate. You're going to have to do things to stop your open source platform from being fragmented. And if you look at the history of Unix, which is the last great operating system before Linux, it cratered because it got too fragmented, because no one was running the show. And it's a really interesting set of exercises where you can start to see how this plays out. And then the question is, how justifiable are the restrictions Google's placing on this, on the Android system? Particularly because they were doing it as a defensive action because they thought they were going to lose the whole market to Apple. And in a market where if you don't let them do certain things to address some of the fragmentation, the real fragmentation problems they have, they may have no choice but to become more Apple-like. And although Apple's generating plenty of criticism, we mentioned Japan, Apple's the dominant operating system in Japan, and it varies country to country, and it's really interesting to see how this plays out. So what's fascinating is, this is a much more complex system than I think that people think about. And I find that, in fact, we can do things like sideload, we can block certain things. And the great puzzle to me that I ask app developers is that they're so mad at Apple for charging them more, although I'm told that Google is essentially getting almost to the same point. But back in the day, I said, why do you write for Apple first? And especially in the US, they had a smaller installed base. They said it's because open source platforms have malware problems. And we know they have security problems, and they're actually getting services out of the Apple vetting that they value for their first initial run. That's what the trade people tell me. It's interesting, but this is a much more, they're getting value for those services, and understanding that and how those payments work, I think is actually really fascinating. Couple things to close off. I'm trying to get to the end. I'm talking too long. Certainty versus flexibility. The rules versus standards tells us that certainty isn't always worth it. In the sense that there's some things I can give you certainty on all legal cases. Plaintiffs win. It's simple, it's certain. We would never agree to this rule because not all plaintiffs should win. And we're going to create strategic incentives for people to bring a bunch of nonsense suits because plaintiffs win. All right? So there's a trade-off. The whole notion of per se illegality and all these, we can make this more certain. We can make it simpler. It'll mean investing a lot up front, and as I said, it only makes sense if you're going to enforce it a lot, and we're going to enforce these cases a handful of times. To me, it's a natural for case by case. But the subject matter is the vertical integration stuff is so ambiguous that you have to study it to really understand it in individual cases. So one of the examples that I'll give you, when Elizabeth Warren supported the US legislation, Her example, she held up an Amazon Basics battery because Amazon promotes their private label battery when you search for the two companies, dominant carriers, companies Eveready and Duracell. Herb Hovenkamp, my colleague who writes the leading antitrust treatise, said she could not have picked a worse example. If you look empirically at US business, batteries have pretty much the highest price cost margin of any product sold online. And that, in fact, from a consumer standpoint, suggesting to people who only know the duopoly that they have a cheaper option, that's a very good comparable quality, it would actually be very, very good for consumers. This is an example of how self-preferencing or vertical integration, or the Google example I gave before, is an ambiguous practice. I went to business school before I went to law school. I worked for Procter & Gamble. My wife worked for General Mills. Private label products are the bane of every branded product's existence. And we'd like to say that they're inferior quality, and yeah, they are a little bit, but not by much. And so this is an interesting thing. It's like, is this a good or bad? We have to think about this in a much more sophisticated way. And is certainty worth it? Well, we can make things certain. We got to do that calculus, and there are simplifications which are worthwhile, but there's a reason we still do tort law with negligence, because those simplifications were never worth it. Innovation, another thing that's interesting. Someone said, okay, what are our tools? There are, under conventional antitrust law, some things which we say are illegal. Price fixing is illegal, per se illegal. Naked exclusion is per se illegal. And we need to do some studies to figure out, are there other practices which are so problematic and so rarely beneficial that it's those cases where certainty is worth it. And to start to do that kind of work. And the good news is those aren't going to change much globally. This is not a Brazil-specific problem generally. But the wrinkle on the other side to me is if you create rules in advance that are wrong, that are too strict, then you can't do the innovation unless you go and lobby for legal change. And if you want, what gets me is innovators don't always know why they're doing what they're doing, and often they try something and they think it's for one reason and it succeeds for a completely different one. And so what they say is, Alman Alkian in UCLA compares it to evolution. What does that mean? Random mutation and natural selection. Try different things, some of it lives, some of it dies. Do we know in advance what's going to live and die? You may think you know, and if we knew, we'd all be rich instead of sitting here. We're not that smart. No one's that smart. Not even any people in government and academics who are really trying hard, we're not that smart. So there's an argument to say, create an environment that encourages raw heterogeneity, find out the hard way, people are willing to put real money behind it, and if it ends up being a problem, rely on competition law as a backstop. And I'm inspired by what Angela Merkel said about the difference between US and EU policy. In the EU, everything that's not permitted is forbidden. In the US, everything that's not forbidden is permitted. And if you want a pro-innovation policy, you do the one that allows people the breathing room to experiment instead of asking for permission. And that's one thing. If it's clearly harmful, stop it. And if it's harmful after the fact, step in. That's how we normally do things, and I think how you create a pro-competitive environment. Let's see. The other basic problem I have with the whole ex-ante regulatory approach based in the DMA is what we've learned is they are not actually trying to create competition in search or in social networks. They are trying to regulate access to the existing search, so-called, if you will, monopoly. And if you think about it from an intellectual standpoint, we only do, if you go to Terminal Railroad, which is the US case that founded all of this, the idea was there was one bridge across the Mississippi River. And it was owned by one railroad company, and they were charging all the other railroad companies more. And so the solution, let's regulate access to the bridge down to competitive levels. Now, here's the problem. Our real solution should be another bridge. Because once you do this, this is forever. Why? If you've regulated down to competitive levels, no one has any incentive to build another bridge. Usually someone enters this because someone's earning extra returns. You try to split that with them, and that's what causes that to happen. If you get it down, why would anyone invest in the other bridge, and why would any other railroad partner with a new bridge company? Their natural investors and strategic partners and sources of business disappear. Now, this makes sense when the second bridge is impossible. But if the second bridge is possible, the regulation may lock the bridge monopoly into place. That's what the big worry is. So the question is, in allocating access to the existing dominant facility, on a dynamic basis, we have to be aware of what we're doing. And if entry is really possible, what we should do is just lower the entry, let them earn their extra money, because that's what's going to attract in the competitor. And that's really, really interesting. And so we have to think about this in a critical sort of way, which is, when does allocating a monopoly facility make sense? Is if you've given up on competition in that sector, that makes sense. But if the competition is possible, even if it takes a long time and very expensive to buy that, you got to let it happen, because late is better than never. And unfortunately, never is what you get if you do too much access regulation. Both the comments and one of the questions talk about a middle ground of possible ideas. And I think that's an interesting idea. Shifting of burdens of proof to me should be a matter of inference. You know, if a practice is generally, I believe the law should be governed by case, but it's more often harmful than beneficial, put the burden of proof on the person who wants to do the practice. If it's more often beneficial than harmful, put the burden on the proof challenging it. That's how you protect consumers, you know, and particularly because if it's a new product, it's hard to get proof because you don't have data. But the interesting question is, when we think about this, is the idea of building in efficiency defenses really takes in this idea of effects, and that's our traditional. We can tweak a lot of things, but the essence of it really is, to me, effect on consumers, because the other stuff risks protecting competitors over consumers. And that's the number one sin in competition law. But we need to figure out how there are all these practices, innovative practices and the like, that may cause prices to increase because they're creating a better quality product and charging people who value it more for it. That's a different kind of competition, a different kind of game. We need to think about how this is working. And I think that different industries compete in different ways at different times. Okay, last thing I'll just say, because I've been talking way too long. The last question about fairness and ecosystems. Fairness is a tough, generally US antitrust law has moved away from fairness. A lot of countries have fair trade commissions, not, if we have a federal trade commission, that's our F, they believe in fairness. Mostly because we don't know what fair is. The big problem I have with the Google case in the US that was just decided is the complainant is Microsoft. Microsoft is the one company in the world that doesn't need the government's help to compete with Google. And if they're talking about fair access, in the short run, it looks like a problem, because by Microsoft's own testimony, they did not invest in mobile platforms because they didn't think that was the next big thing. They took their chance, they were wrong, and now they're discovering, oh crap, we have a problem. So if I were to analogize this, we're both about to walk through the desert. I have the foresight to bring water. You don't. We get halfway across the desert, and you say, you have to give me some of your water. If I give you some of my water, I'm putting myself at risk. I can buy this bottle of water for a few reals, right? But in the desert, I'm charging you more than few reals. That's not fair. It's not fair because I saw fit to pack my backpack full of water before we did something, and you took your chances. That, after the fact, fairness has a really strange way of making things look. Especially when you think about ex-ante risk when you take new businesses and 95% plus of businesses fail. And so I am leery of the notion of fairness. I'm leery of the notion of ecosystems, because what we see is large vertically integrated businesses that deliver services. And what we see, for example, in the advertising ecosystem, we actually are seeing the rise of an effective third competitor. That is Amazon. We thought it was going to be Apple for a long time. It's going to be Amazon. Now, would we love to see a standalone company doing this just in advertising? Yes, but that's just not the way this business works. A lot of businesses work. So I always think of automobile companies. Toyota is a manufacturer. They have dedicated part suppliers. They have dedicated retail outlets. Shouldn't we have any part company be able to sell with Toyota? Maybe, but you know what? That kind of vertical integration is yielding benefits, and maybe by trying to make them all mix and match at every level, you lose something. And that's what the evidence tends to tell us. Ecosystems are very badly defined. There's a whole bunch of literature trying to figure out what they mean. The answer is nobody really knows. It's kind of this hand wave thing. It's like terms like big, like GAFA or big tech, just lump them all together. We don't have to do the analysis. To me, we need to sit there and go through them one at a time and figure out what the business models are. They all use data in different ways. They all use different pricing. And actually do the hard work of the traditional way we do things. And if we find some rough cut ideas that are fairly generalizable, maybe we can do something that looks like a rule. But we have to make sure we know what we're doing, because if not, we're going to draw lines on rules that aren't very good. I've talked way too long, so I will stop there.
So I don't know if anyone have any additional comment or provocation. No, I think we are. So we came to the end of this amazing event. Again, thank you so much, Professor, all the panelists. It was an honor to have you here, for all the confidence you are. It was really an honor. And I also want to extend my thank you now. I saw Luis here from the Alumni Club, also Leonor, for all the help. And thank you everyone that is present here. So I hope to see you all soon. Thank you so much.